I first got involved with Castle Door way back in 1980, something or other. There was a funny old man, shouldn't call him that properly, called Alan Griffiths, who lived in Lostwithiel, and he'd retired to Lostwithiel. In fact, he'd been in the civil service up in London, and he was a rowing nutcase. He was about 70 at the time, and he had bought an old, fairly clapped out clinker 4 off the army, and he brought it down, had it transported down to Lostwithiel, and he loaded it up with his son, who rowed, his son-in-law, who didn't row, and 2 local neighbours who had rowed at school, I think. Anyway, and they went off for the first outing of what became Castle Door Rowing Club. And they put it in the river at Lostwithiel and set off downstream and hit a rock and put a fairly large hole in the bottom of it. But they were able to sort of patch it up and carried on rowing. And they arrived eventually down here in Gallant. And I just happened to be, purely by chance, standing on the quay at the time. And I called them over and said, "What the hell do you think you're doing rowing on this river?" And Alan came over and sort of explained. And they didn't know what to do with the boat afterwards, so we took it out of the water and just put it on an old box beside the railway. And that was where it stayed for several months after that. And we got a group of people who had rowed mostly at school or college, had a few outings together, and that was the beginning of Castle Door Rowing Club. In fact, Alan Griffiths called it. He wanted to have the portcullis effect because the connection with the silver. He was an income tax collector, in fact, and he wanted to have the symbol. So he sort of thought of Castle Door, and we became Castle Door Rowers, and there was a bank account opened at the time, and that was the beginning of it. The original players in the group, there's John Reed, who was a farmer over on the other side of the river, who had rowed quite seriously at university. Jerry Williams, who had rowed also quite seriously at university. In fact, I rowed against him at Henley. Alan's son-in-law, Don Thompson, who was a solicitor, who was quite useful to have. And then a few others who sort of came along from time to time and joined in. It ran itself, basically. The club in the very first days pretty much ran itself, much as it is today. It had a captain and a sort of committee. In fact, to begin with, it didn't have a committee. It just had a group of us. And we got down at one stage to Andrew Vandenbroek and myself, Alan Griffiths, and for want of anybody better, my wife Vivian was invited to be the secretary. Not that she's been a secretary of anything else before. So anyway, we were talking about it and getting arrangements. And somebody in the pub said, "Oh, you're going to have a committee meeting. I hear the telephone box isn't being used that weekend." What facilities were available for the club? Absolutely nothing. No. I say we kept the boat on trestles out in the open air, just beside the railway line. We had no changing rooms, nothing. That was it. It was only quite a lot later that we managed to get hold of originally the lease on where the shed is, where our boathouse is at the moment, was a corrugated iron shed, which had been a boat builder's yard. So that was the facilities. Didn't have any changing rooms or anything. It was just boat storage, and it was 41 3/4 feet long, and I had to take a large hammer and make a bulge in one end so we actually get a boat in with a bow ball. We didn't know what we were to begin with. The early days, we were just a group of people who enjoyed each other's company and like rowing together. We weren't particularly looking to compete or do anything like that at all. It was only later that we had an open day, and a few people came up who'd never rowed before and came and joined in, and that was where really, I suppose, it started expanding. And then quite a lot later, we got into something called Project Awesome, which was an initiative by the British Rowing to try and connect clubs with schools that didn't row, sort of away from the traditional rowing schools. And any club that signed up, I think it was involved training twice a week, I think, 2 nights a week, and ergos and that sort of thing as well. And in return for which they got supplied with a whole lot of kit. And we were absolutely amazed when this kit arrived, because it was 2 fours, 2 doubles, 2 singles, 3 viruses, a safety boat, a boat trailer, life jackets, everything you could need to have a rowing club sort of in a package. It just arrived, and that was where we expanded. We ran it for, I think, 8 years. I think we ran it, and out of it we came out with 3 Olympic oarsmen, and a couple of national, 1 world champion. So we did quite well by the program, and it did quite well by us. It was good. The very first competition that the club entered was a regatta at Stythians. We rowed as men's novice or boys novice, or whatever it was. They had start at Stythians was with boat boys holding the rudder. In theory, it's supposed to let go when the umpire said. In fact, the little boy who was holding ours didn't, and got pulled into the water. So we didn't do very well on that particular regatta. But we went to various regattas. Once we sort of started and got ourselves a bit established, and it became known that there was another little club down in Cornwall, Weir latched on to us pretty quickly and said, we've got to sign up. And so we didn't have any choice, we just signed up. We were told that our colour was to be purple, which was, some people would say, an inspired choice. I think my favourite memories of the club are the trips that we did overseas. We set up a thing called the Cruising Club, which was not just Castle Door, it was open to all sorts of odds and sorts, oarsmen from mainly across the west of England, but a few from further afar. And initially we rowed down the Thames. We spent 2 weekends at it, stopped overnight and rowed on. So we did from Oxford eventually through to Putney in London. And that was fun, especially the evenings. And then I just happened to employ, and I swear I didn't know it at the time, I employed a bloke who was a German international oarsman. And we got talking, and he said, "We just come and row in Germany." So we rowed down the Moselle from near Trier right down through to where it joins up with the Rhine, and that was 2 weekends, and they really were fun. We took part in Bernkastel Regatta, and one, and there's a large bowl in the pub in Gallant to commemorate it. And we drank a lot of wine, and it was that was lovely. Those are, I think, my favourite moments.
I first got involved with Castle Door in 1979, by which time the club had been going some 5 years after those rudimentary start with Alan Griffiths. And that was the reason why he was the club president for so long, through those early years of the club. We were down here on holiday, and I'd heard that there was a brand new rowing club in Cornwall, Greenbank Falmouth being the only other one at the time. And I rang a member of the club that might even have been Alastair, who said, well, in fact, we're having our annual dinner this weekend. Why don't you come along? So we did. And the annual dinner was held at the Penpillic Hotel, which no longer exists. It later became a residential home, and now it's a holiday complex. I keep meaning to pop back in and see if there's any blue plaque on the wall mentioning Castle Door from those days, but I suspect not. But it was quite obvious that there was a lot of enthusiasm behind the early days of the club. Jerry Williams, our first chairman, Alastair was the treasurer for so long in the early days. David Evans, who was another upcountry export, came down and was, I think, the first secretary. But of course, I didn't really link in with the club properly until we actually moved down here, because my work brought me to Truro in 81. And then they decided that it would be a really good idea if I would become the club captain the following year. At that stage, we were still keeping what boats we had on scaffolding racks alongside the railway line by the level crossing. You can't get to that area anymore. It's all fenced off. It wasn't particularly convenient at the time. As we all know, trains don't run along that line particularly frequently. But nevertheless, trying to finagle a boat off the rack, out of that narrow space, over the level crossing and then into the water, led to some tricky manoeuvring. So it came as a blessed relief when we were able to take the lease on what was then known as Mickey Morgan's shed, which was the green corrugated iron hut with absolutely no facilities. And as Alastair has already described, was not in fact long enough to contain a fore without some serious remodelling of the structure of the boathouse itself. And even the fores then had to be laid in the boathouse diagonally on. You certainly couldn't have nice racking space with the boats parallel up each wall. So that was a distant dream at the time. When we started to get involved in Weir regattas, I was quite keen that the club should involve itself in events outside the west of England. And as we all know, that's tricky. It's very time consuming and it's very expensive to take crews out of the west of England. And that is why so many of the clubs in Weir choose simply to do the Weir circuit. I felt that the members of the club needed a bit of outside exposure as to what the real world was all about. And that was why we entered the Head of the River race here for the first time, I think in 1982 or 83. Now, to enter the Eight's Head, first off, you need an 8. And we didn't have one. The people that did were Weir. Weir had one wooden 8 that they used to lend out to whichever club wanted use of it at the time. And we borrowed it, and we trained in it. And training went moderately well. The trouble was that we tended to have different crews each week, which didn't lead to consistency. And we had some interesting time with some of our relatively inexperienced coxes. I can remember one time we were doing a piece going upstream at St Winnow, and we were in the middle of the river, and there was suddenly a sickening crunch, and we stopped moving because we'd run aground. And Stroke had to happen to mention to the cox that when the seagulls are standing on the surface of the water, that's not because it's Sunday. So we went up to London. We made our mark. Quite a scary experience, racing alongside 420 other eights. It's a major event, but hopefully they got by with the experience. The other big thing for me was not simply going down and training and racing, but for me there was a tremendous community spirit about the club at that time. And on high days and holidays, particularly on spring tides, the call would go out that everybody would pour down to the water's edge, and we would clamber on board any boat that was available, oar-driven or motor-driven, and we would go to the pub. And typically we'd go up to the pub at Lerin, which is only accessible on a spring tide. There was only time for one pint or two if you were quick before the tide turned and you had to get out again, otherwise you'd gone aground. But these were tremendously social occasions. Other times we went down to Polruan, which of course was easier because there's water all the time down there. Trying to get a lot of crews into Gallant Village is just not possible. So in those days we used to base all the activity at Caffer Mill. We used to pay the council a sum of money, and they used to fence off part of Caffer Mill, and that allowed us to organise crews and boating facilities, obviously sharing the slope with the ferry. We used to run the course downstream, so we'd start at St Winnow Church and finish at Town Quay at Foy, and that's 4¼ miles. And I knew that because we'd measured it, because 4¼ miles is the distance of the championship course in London. So that when we were training for the Head River race, that was the distance that the guys knew they had to race when we went up to the Big Smoke on unfamiliar territory.
Players. Right, well, there was Alan, obviously.
Hang on, the main players at that time.
Sorry, yes.
Who was the captain?
But he was a funny, temperamental sort of bloke, and he didn't last very long.